Jeffrey Veatch, welcome to Newsbreakers.
Well, thank you for having me.
Very much looking forward to this conversation. You and I have discussed we find ourselves on opposite sides of the debate over legalizing marijuana. You come from a very personal standpoint and the experience that you had with your son, Justin. Tell us about Justin.
Well, Justin was a very healthy young boy as he grew up in Yorktown, New York. He played sports, he loved skateboarding and things like that, but he had a particular talent, and it was music. And he had piano lessons when he was 6 years old on the grand piano. He began to play recitals and things like that. And he blew us away because he began to gravitate to a variety of instruments. But it wasn't just listening and playing. He was beginning to write music, and he wrote songs. And he actually recorded 6 songs, and 4 of them were done in professional studios, and another 2 we did when we set him up, in the basement with a little home studio situation. And so, we were very proud of him. He was very creative and very smart, good student, but things changed. When he was 17, we lost Justin. He died of an accidental drug overdose, and he snorted heroin, which in 2008 was a rather shocking situation, especially in a suburban area like we live in. But it all started when he was 14 with marijuana. So I talk a lot about drugs because that's what we do, but we created a nonprofit. We had to do something.
And I'd like you to tell me about it. It's the Jeffrey Veatch Foundation?
The Justin Veatch Fund.
And
it's a 501c3. We decided when we lost Justin, and there was more of a stigma at this time, with drugs. We had to make a decision, and we decided we had to tell the story. We had to find out what happened as best we could, and it took a lot of time to figure out exactly where we were and where we were going. And we decided, instead of being quiet about what happened, we would make a lot of noise about it. We had the opportunity to go on national television, on Good Morning America, and tell the story. And we decided to create the nonprofit. And we started out like any parent would who loses a child, create scholarships. So we did that, and we began to do other things for talented musical teens like Justin. But I had one mission in mind in the back of my head, that we had to tell his story and to figure out how to effectively tell the story for the good of the world. Because it's a terrible thing, to lose someone from a drug overdose.
Is the focus of the fund all drugs, or how do you get from that to the position that you've taken about recreational marijuana?
Well, we started out with scholarships, and then we did music programs. We sponsored open mics for the kids like Justin in our community. That led us to music workshops in the summer. We even sponsored concerts once a year, where some talented kids we got to know through our programs got to open for a headliner. And it was a lot of fun to do that, but I knew at the same time I had to work up some kind of message for the kids. And it took me a while, but my brother-in-law booked speakers in colleges, and he was trying to talk me into doing this because I had been on the radio. And he said, well, you'd be a natural speaker. So it took a lot of time and soul searching and searching his past and looking through everything and getting pictures together. I ended up with a multimedia talk. It's 40 minutes long. It has like 100 and some odd clips of music and film clips and pictures. And I tell Justin's story, and the kids that I speak to, mostly teens and sometimes 8th graders, they get to know Justin. And when I tell them about what happened, of course, it's very, very, very hurtful. And then we backtrack through certain parts of his life to figure out what happened. And what I try to do is piece it together and explain how it might happen to them or their friends. And it's not that hard, to have this happen. And then the idea of the talk is to inspire them to take better care of themselves, and also, very importantly, to watch out for their friends. And I don't know, many people don't realize this, certainly the kids don't. They know their friends better than their parents do when they're outside the house. And some of the things that Justin's friends knew about him, they didn't share with us. And that's part of my talk. I talk about them, and we had a chance to interview them on video 6 years after Justin died, and they were wonderful. But we got to learn a lot more, and that helped my talk too.
So, and the information and the education is so important with
Yeah.
young people. It's really the best prep that they can have when facing these issues. I'm curious, how marijuana, how did that enter your thinking in terms of what happened to your son?
Okay, well, it was just part of what happened. I knew that my son had died. We had the autopsy, and the medical examiner had to spend time figuring out what was in his system. And at the time he died, there was a number of substances there, and heroin was the drug that put him over the top, and he snorted it through his snort. He was never even addicted to heroin, but he was taking a lot of different substances. What happened as we went back through Justin's time, when he was 14, he decided he would smoke marijuana with his friends, and this is quite common, so even then in 2008. And as parents, we didn't want him to do that, and we had counseling, and we did all kinds of things to try to, dissuade him from this. But Justin doubled down. He said, well, I've done research. Nobody ever died from marijuana, and, correctly so if you put it in that perspective. But that's not looking at the big picture. But what I do through my talk is I say that he started with marijuana, but he didn't react the same way other young people do to marijuana, take it or leave it. It had a different impact on Justin, and we've learned, and I spent a lot of time studying this, we learned that we cannot predict how one person is going to react to marijuana. And for Justin, it became a gateway because he began to turn to other substances, and he was actually self-medicating, which is something we have to, as parents, we have to keep an eye on our kids and figure out if they're having problems. He didn't tell us this.
Right.
We all learned it later,
The science tells us that there's not a physical addictive quality to marijuana, but it can be psychologically addictive in much the same way that a lot of things can be. So, do you think he was psychologically addicted to marijuana, or do you think it was simply the gateway that in your mind led him to other more dangerous drugs?
Well, I think what he did, he liked the marijuana, but he wanted to explore other avenues. And he had anxieties. He was self-medicating. And that took him down different avenues in exploring, different drugs. And whether he became addicted to marijuana, and I don't know whether that's true, although the facts, the studies show that 9% of people get addicted to marijuana. It could be because of psychological factors, but that number goes up to 17 with young people. 17%, and I have a friend who's a medical doctor who specializes in drug in therapy for addicts, and he would put the number at 20% of people who use marijuana regularly are actually addicted to it. But as far as the damage goes, the marijuana, my whole issue over legalization is not necessarily for adults, and certainly marijuana has some great benefits for people who claim it for medical reasons.
Sure.
And we have not done enough research. We really need to do more, and there's kind of a conundrum, a catch-22 when it comes to marijuana. We know that it's a Schedule I drug, for example, and the research just simply hasn't been as good as it should be to understand more about the THC and the CBD oil and things like that. But so I believe truly that, for Justin it was a gateway. Without marijuana, he wouldn't have been involved in the other drugs.
Well, that was going to be my note. Do you think had it not been for the marijuana, he might not have progressed to heroin?
I think, well, I can only guess, of course.
Right.
I don't think so because, well, it could have been alcohol. It could have been anything because he had an addictive personality, perhaps. And I tell young people, if you have a history of substance abuse in your family, that should be a red flag to you to be careful. Not only to be careful, maybe you better avoid it altogether. For Justin, we never had drug issues in our family, but we did have a history of alcoholism in our family. So that could have been part of it, but he didn't like alcohol. He liked marijuana, and then he went on to the other substances that got him in trouble.
I was going to ask about alcohol only because people make a lot of comparisons in terms of the legality versus illegality of the two, and people point to some of the more immediate dangers that they see coming from alcohol than they do from marijuana. You said he didn't like alcohol. He didn't.
No, he claimed he did, and I think he drank a beer every now and then. You know, he was, of course, not supposed to be drinking
Right.
at age 17, and just like you're not supposed to be using, you know, other drugs like marijuana. Kids always push the limits on that, but I don't, you know, it's hard to say, you know, when you go back, why and, you know, what direction he would have gone in. We know that Justin's friends who also smoked marijuana didn't have the same problem that he did. Now, a couple of them might have had issues where they got into other drugs and been in trouble with it, but by and large, the ones that we talked to and got to know over the years, for them, you know, they did well. One's an architect, another's an engineer. They have successful lives. It didn't have the impact they did. Who knows? They probably still smoke marijuana, but it didn't have the same impact on them.
I want to make sure we don't go too far into this conversation before expressing my sympathies and my gratitude for your contribution to the conversation, and I appreciate that. Is there a middle ground that you think would be a happy solution, a medium point, if you will? Is there a space between complete prohibition and legalization that you think might be an appropriate?
Well, there are lots of things, and there are lots of issues on both sides. First of all, decriminalization, we believe is vital.
Yeah.
I believe is vital. I've kind of aligned myself with most of the views of a group called Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which is headed up by Kevin Sabet, who was a White House advisor on drug policy for Presidents Obama and Clinton and Bush. And he got together with Patrick Kennedy to create this organization that does a lot of research on marijuana. And of course, they're in the front lines battling, you know, states over legalization. And the research they have on their website, learnaboutsam.org, is pretty convincing. But they do believe in decriminalization. And in fact, I take a strong view that too many people have gotten in trouble for the nonsense of possessing marijuana. In fact, though, in Westchester County, for example, they no longer prosecute small amounts of marijuana. The police departments have stated that you're not going to arrest these people. We have a town judge on our board of directors, the Justin Veatch Fund, and he says, well, we can't even we don't even prosecute them when they come before my court. They're not coming anymore. But he is very strongly in favor of drug courts, and there are a lot of other levels. But as far as marijuana goes, like I say, there needs to be some common ground and some middle ground. I believe that. I don't believe marijuana should be Schedule I drug like heroin. It's just not the same. However, you know, that's the way it's set up in the government. And to get to another point, I'm not sure. But there's a concern about legalization. I'll tell you why we're concerned. Legalizing marijuana for recreational use kind of opens the door to the commercialization of a product like Big Tobacco did back in the days when they were marketing cigarettes. And the feeling is that if it's made legal, the teens will, you know, take advantage of this. And my concern is teens. Now, I know that the perception among teens about marijuana has changed over the years. Only 30% believe there's a serious problem, there's a serious danger. It used to be 70%, now it's only 30%.
You bring up an interesting point because the commercialization is a concern, but similarly, you can't watch a ball game without being inundated with beer ads and whiskey ads. I mean, we're now, for years you couldn't advertise hard liquor on television. Now you can. A lot of people think that alcohol is just as, if not more dangerous than marijuana.
Absolutely.
How do you square that concern with where we are with alcohol?
Alcohol is as dangerous or more dangerous than marijuana, and more dangerous than many drugs. So many people die of alcoholism from it. You know, alcohol poisoning, it's a very serious problem. However, it's been with us for many, many years, and it's kind of hard to turn that spigot off because, you know, it's part of the law, it's legal. We just don't want to see another, substance come into play here. And the idea that marijuana would be legalized for recreational use sends a message to the kids, because they're always pushing the limits.
Sure.
And they'll get a hold of it more easily. But there's another argument. What about the purity of what's on the market? We know that Canada now has legalized marijuana for recreational use, but there's a big black market in the other stuff, and it's still there.
I've heard and read some reports that say it's easier for a teenager to get a hold of marijuana than it is to get a hold of alcohol. Because you go to a store, you have to have ID, they're afraid they're going to lose their license.
Right.
Whereas everything in the marijuana market is the black market, so it's more accessible.
Yeah.
Do you give any credence to that argument? Do you think if you legalized it, it might be more difficult for teenagers to have access to it?
That's been a tough point with both sides of this argument, because there is an argument for legalization to keep it pure and keep it controlled. However, we can't control the black market, but the other argument is it's kind of like sends a message. It's like inviting the kids to the party. There's no winning side here. I think we've got to figure out a way to get together about this and have a consensus. But the number one concern is with teens. In my
Sure.
situation, I do talks to kids, and the concern is what marijuana does to a young person's brain. If they're under 25, the research shows that it does cause a problem. It rewires the brain,
Certainly.
and it lessens their cognitive ability, for memory and what have you. And vaping is another thing that I'm concerned about. Cigarettes have been going down over the years, but vaping is way up now with teens. And well, the CDC's Centers for Disease Control recently did a study that showed in a survey, I guess it was a survey, that 2 million middle and high school students said they actually vaped marijuana products. So there's there's a concern. I think we have to be in control of what's out there, and there are some things that happen that we don't see happening in advance.
There's another something else that caught my eye, and I wanted to ask you about it. That in New York State and in other states as well, the medical marijuana program now has an allotment. You can be accepted and get medical marijuana to treat opioid addiction. That it helps ameliorate some of the, I guess, pains that you go through when you're trying to get off of opioids. And that there's a medicinal value, at least according to New York State, using marijuana as a tool to help somebody with an opioid addiction. And yet you're coming from the standpoint of your son's progress in your mind from marijuana to opioids. And I'm just wondering how you countenance that.
Well, whatever helps. Of course, opioids are much more serious, and you can die of an overdose very easily. Marijuana is different, although we're seeing marijuana laced with fentanyl and things like that now, which is very scary.
Yes.
I think as far as medical treatment goes, marijuana may be may play a big role in medicine in the future, but there needs to be more studies. And I do believe in medically assisted treatment for opioid addicts, and I've talked to a number of them who said it saved them. Ultimately, the goal was to be abstinent, but the medically assisted treatment actually helps them get through, and have a normal life where they're not going through the day searching for a substance to keep them going and then lose sight of everything else. So medically assisted treatment for drug abuse is important. And if you say, well, marijuana will play a role in that, and if it does successfully, well, that sounds like a good idea. But I really think the research needs to be ramped up.
Sure.
We see all the CBD products coming out, that are treating various ailments, and only one drug has been approved by the FDA to treat seizures. Yet, you see these on every store now. They're selling CBD for this and that, headaches, what have you. We don't really know if they work,
we don't.
But placebo is a very powerful thing,
I've often wondered if perhaps marijuana might make a viable alternative for for some people to opioids. People who would otherwise have a tendency towards opioids and towards an opioid addiction. As we said before, people tend to self-medicate, and the history of mankind is that we tend to seek ways to alter our mental state at one point or another. And that for some people, the high from marijuana might satisfy the craving that they might otherwise fill with a high from
well,
an opioid.
that could be a reasonable assumption if it works, and if it's under supervision, and if they're successful with it. I mean, you've got heroin addicts or opioid addicts being treated with Suboxone and drugs like that will alleviate their issues, and the marijuana might hold value there. But again, we're kind of in a situation where it's a catch-22. We can't seem to find that middle ground.
It is. If marijuana, if recreational marijuana or adult use, as the language in a lot of states, is legalized in New York, and a set percentage of the tax revenue, let's say, was dedicated towards, youth education, drug counseling, drug treatment, would that be enough to satisfy some of the concerns that you have here? Or is that splitting the baby, or is that still opening the door to too much?
It might be if it's very carefully written. Unfortunately, studies about what happened in Colorado show that the social cost of legalizing the drug has far outweighed the benefits of the tax revenue and things like that. There's a lot of studies about also drugged driving, marijuana, people consuming marijuana products and driving and drinking on top of that, that have been a problem. That's causing great concern, but there's something in there, there's certainly something in there that could be helpful. And medical marijuana is here to stay, I know that. And marijuana is here to stay, whether it's legal or not. It seems as though in New York State, for example, and I just read in New Jersey and New Hampshire and Vermont, it seems like the legalizing marijuana will not pass, at least in 2019. And the New York State Governor Cuomo has indicated that the legislature won't pass it either in New York this year. But there is talk that if it doesn't pass, that they'll boost the they'll boost the ability of people to use medical marijuana in a more beneficial way. So there may be a compromise there.
It seems like your position is basically, let's keep the status quo as it is, at least until we have more information, but to prevent the unanticipated consequences, like what happened with to Justin.
Well, certainly we need to take our time and not rush to judgment, and certainly there needs to be more research, and that's the fault of our government. We have not taken a strong enough, a unified position to get more information, which we really need.
But if I countered that by saying the status quo has led to the litany of problems that we have now, including what happened to your son. And so I wonder if is the status quo good enough? Does the status quo really that good if we've had as many negative effects or negative results as we have?
Well, the status quo is not good enough, clearly, because we have a social problem, and we haven't controlled it very well. We have to make a decision as to where to draw the line and how to organize this in a more logical way to protect people. And I hope the government, when they consider these bills, really takes into account all the arguments on both sides. I went to a couple of listening sessions in New York State when people were speaking out, and then people made their case, people on one side and people on the other. I don't buy the ones that say we want to take the opportunity to have a business. To me, that's not a good enough argument. To make money and to bring money into the state for in taxes and things like that. It's not a good enough argument because of the social issue that's involved around it. So it's a hard one.
It is.
And I hope we can solve it. And I understand the views, but my mission, so to speak, is to convince teens to stay away from it.
Well,
The
and I think
longer they wait.
that's going to be an essential element,
Yeah.
whether it's legalized recreationally
Yeah.
or not,
Yeah.
is that continuing education. It's a leap of faith, whichever way
Yeah.
this winds up going. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention, or any question that I should have asked but haven't asked?
Well, I want to talk about the film that
Please.
We were approached 4 years after Justin died by a couple of filmmakers from Jacob Burns Film Center in Pleasantville, and they wanted to do a documentary. And lo and behold, I didn't know they were that serious, but they followed us around for 2.5 years, and we ended up with the film Whispering Spirits. It's a documentary. Student Assistance Services in Terrytown wrote 2 discussion guides for teens and community to go with the film. Stephen Apcon, the co-founder of Jacob Burns, who's created this company called Reconsider, which is trying to develop films for social issues, he provided us a grant so we could get that film out into the public. And we went down to the CADCA convention in Washington a couple of years ago, Community Anti-Drug Coalitions, a really large organization, and managed to get the film in their hands. And it's gotten used by coalitions in 26 states from California to Maine. But the film is beautiful. It's all my son's music is in there, but it tells the story about what happened, and it teaches people that no family is immune from the perils of substance abuse. We're very proud of the film, and it's basically free. You can see it online.
I was going to ask, how can people find it?
Whispering-spirits.com.
Whispering-spirits.com.
The dash is important, and you can watch the film, you can read the discussion guides, and you can also order a copy of the DVD.
Well, I want to thank you for your advocacy, and I want to thank you for the conversation, and I hope we continue this conversation, as no doubt the state continues its conversation.
Well, your good work, appreciate that, and the more we talk about it, the better a place we'll be in. Absolutely.
Jeffrey Veatch is the president of the Justin Veatch Fund. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate it.